And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing low pressure bringing more wind and rain into Kodiak Island and Bristol Bay. Rain and snow over the southwest part of the state with some light snow extending up to the western Arctic coast into the western Brooks Range. Dry eastern interior down the Panhandle. And for tomorrow, this front moves northward with gale, possible storm force winds here in advance of it, especially in the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast. And light winds, sunshine for the southeast coast. Fair and mild over the eastern interior, and not too bad over the Bering Sea with higher pressure out there to the west. And then for Thursday, not a lot of difference between the two charts for tomorrow, as you can see. Still low pressure now, a little farther to the south. Front hung up just over southern Kodiak Island, so steady rain continues there. Some of that moisture getting up into the Kenai Peninsula and southern Cook Inlet, and a trough stuck out here in the west. Keeps it unsettled out in that area, but pretty nice conditions. Central and eastern part of the state with even warmer temperatures each day. Same thing for the southeast coast. Coastal water forecast, south coast of the Panhandle, southeast winds 10 knots. Central coast, southeast 15 to 20 knots, and the north coast, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And we've got southeast winds of 15 there for Clarence Strait, northwest at 10 for Stevens Passage, northwest 15 knots for Lynn Canal. And for the day Thursday, south coast here, southeast winds 15 knots, central and north coast, southeast winds 15 to 25 knots, or 15 to 20 knots, north at 15 for Lynn Canal, and north winds 20 knots for Stevens Passage. Clarence Strait, southeast winds at 20. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories tomorrow, east winds 25 knots, and gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, east winds 30 to 45 knots, and we've got storm warnings out for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, east winds 55 knots, gale warnings for southern Cook Inlet for northeast winds at 35 knots, northeast 25 for northern Cook Inlet. And for Thursday, gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast, east winds 40 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, east of 45 knots, and gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, east winds at 40 knots. Small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And for Prince William Sound, east winds at 20 knots with 4-foot seas. Kodiak Island tomorrow, winds right out of the east at 45 knots with seas up to 23 feet. Bristol Bay, east winds at 30 knots, northwest 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And for Thursday, north to northwest winds 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Bristol Bay, east winds at 25 knots. Kodiak Island, east to northeasterlies at 30 to 35 knots with 9 to 16-foot seas. And for the eastern Aleutians, gale warnings tomorrow, northwest winds 35 to 40 knots, northwest 30-knot winds for Adak and Atka. Lighter as you head west here, west-northwest at 15 to 20 knots west of Adak out to Shemya. And then for Thursday, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots for the western Aleutians here. Central areas, northwest at about 20 knots. And then for the Fox Islands, northwest 30 to 40 knot winds. And for the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, winds will be predominantly northeast at 25 knots. Yukon Delta coast, north at 20 knots. And St. Lawrence Island, east winds 15 knots, southeast at 15 for Norton Sound. Pribilof Islands, northwest winds 40 knots. That's good for a gale warning, 14-foot seas there, and northwest at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. And for Thursday, Pribilof, small craft advisories, northwest 25 knots, seas down to 11 feet now, and northwest at 20 for St. Matthew Island and the Yukon Delta coast, north at 20 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, northwest at 15. St. Lawrence Island, southeast of 15 for Norton Sound. Eastern Boulevard Seacoast tomorrow, light northeast breeze 5 to 10 knots, northeast of 15 on the central coast, west side northeast at 20 knots, and kind of variable winds here for the Chukchi Sea at 15 to 25 knots. And for the next day, Chukchi Sea, east-northeast winds at 20 knots, northeast 20 for the central and western Arctic coast, while the eastern Boulevard Seacoast will be looking at a east wind at 15 to 20 knots.